So the state of biblical scholarship in the church. With the dawn of the historical critical method in the mid to late 19th century, a great though untested tool was available to bring literary techniques to the study of sacred scripture. This was virtually a century after the newly established discipline of biblical theology, as a distinct branch of theology from dogmatic theology, had come into existence by J.P. Gabler in 1787. So, although there was always a kind of exegesis in the church, in 1787, as he was being inducted into his professorial role in, I'm not sure, I think it was Germany or Austria, but he was insisting that there should be a discipline of theology that's really biblical theology, that's distinct from dogmatic theology, and then about 100 years later, the arrival of the historical critical method as literary techniques came into being. However, it took half a century for the new science of the historical critical method to mature. Providentissimus Deus in 1893 by St. Leo XIII declared that it was not yet time for its use in scripture scholarship. As an untried method, it came with much promise, but equally with its many inherent limits. So it was not until the wake of Divino Flammate Spiritu in 1943 that Catholic biblical scholars began to use the historical critical method as a legitimate technique for the study of sacred scripture, with the approbation of the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Up to that point, some had gotten their hands very badly burnt because they were using this technique and they were under a cloud, or didn't want to be under a cloud, with the magisterium for questioning, dating and all that sort of thing, authorship, all those sorts of questions that we're all very familiar with. The Pontifical Biblical Commission, which up until that time was made up solely of cardinals, only some of whom were expert in the field of sacred scripture, were charged with the oversight of the study of scripture and its orthodoxy. Meanwhile, in the world of Catholic scholarship, there was still a great deal of uncertainty about the proper way to proceed, despite the new encouragement given by the then recent magisterial document. While some scholars were ready to launch into fresh scholarship using a technique previously off limits, others were hesitant, not least of which on account of the statements made by the same Pontifical Biblical Commission regarding the study of the Old Testament early in the 20th century. Within the space of a few months in 1947, 2 brief publications were made in reputable journals from authoritative members of the hierarchy to the effect that Catholic scripture scholars were free to explore and study scripture using the newly approved historical critical method. Yet no authoritative publication from the magisterium was made to that effect. So I don't know what the publication were, but I think it was a German publication. One I think was the secretary for the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which up until that time was still an arm of the magisterium. And then secondly, I think it was the secretary for the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith, but they had both made the publication. They had both made the publication under published it in non-authoritative sources, so they were just published for scholars. So they knew basically, guys, it's free to go. You're not going to be prosecuted. So the debate continued into the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council in its dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, Dei Verbum. Some of the Council Fathers were seeking clarification on the concept of the inerrancy of sacred scripture, which was, and still is, Catholic doctrine. Number 11, paragraph 11. In the absence of sufficient consensus among the Council Fathers as to the overlap between scripture and tradition, the document, in 1965, said that sacred scripture and sacred tradition were 2 sources of divine revelation, and both form a part of the one deposit of the faith. Both are faithfully interpreted by the teaching office, namely the sacred magisterium, which does not stand above them, but serves them. In the wake of Dei Verbum, St. Paul VI decided to reform the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1971, removing its status as a body of the magisterium of the Catholic Church, and simultaneously replaced the cardinal members with a body of expert scripture scholars who were priests. Now, basically anybody who's suitably qualified could be on there, so my my supervisor in Rome. She was a nun and a Spanish woman. She was on one of the members. Another member who was a nun, also the head of the biblical theology department at the Gregorian, she was on there too, and lots of priests, and they tried to sort of keep it from around the world. The commission was to remain under the auspices of the sacred congregation of the doctrine of the faith, so that it could be a mechanism of dialogue with the magisterium on scriptural matters. Its statements would be considered as theological opinion, yet with a certain place of privilege. And I had an opportunity when I was in Rome back in 2015 to run into the prefect of the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith at the time, and this question was bugging me. I thought, is it magisterium or is it not? And he says, no, it's definitely theological opinion, but its auspices under the same building as the Sacred Congregation for Doctrine and Faith. So it enjoys a spiritual privilege, a special privileged place of theology, you might say. So while it's still theological opinion, we're not bound in conscience by it, but still we would be silly to kind of ignore the direction that it's pointing at. And that's why I brought the copy of the document in 1993 that I'll make reference to in a little bit. I just made reference to that and John Paul II gives a lovely sort of 10-page introduction, that's magisterium, but to basically launch the document. So source, form and redaction criticism. With the doorway opened to the new method, scholars sought to test the historical reliability of the Gospels. And because I'm quoting so frequently from Kina and France, I'm not going to keep saying, but I'm quoting a lot from them. So scholars sought to test the historical reliability of the Gospels. So their attention naturally turned to source criticism. Source criticism asks the question, what written sources might the author of a Gospel have used? Scholars who study Greco-Roman literature have increasingly recognized the weaknesses of traditional source criticism. But the criteria appear somewhat more objective in Matthew, where we probably retain evidence for at least 2 of Matthew's sources. However, source criticism by itself is not sufficient to study the Gospels, because ultimately one is dealing with elements that are impossible to demonstrate, even with the limited advantage we have in the case of the Gospel of Matthew. Because the early Christians told and retold the stories about Jesus orally before writing Gospels, scholars also began to ask about the way the early Christians transmitted them and developed form criticism. Many form critics noted that Jesus used teaching forms popular among his contemporaries, such as parables, witty sayings, and that early Christians transmitted Jesus' sayings and deeds in forms used by other biographers and storytellers of their day. Some form critics started with skeptical presuppositions and consequently produced studies with predictably skeptical conclusions. Others started with less skeptical premises and produced more favorable conclusions. However, this approach has proved ironic, for we know far less about the earliest transmitting communities than we know about the historical Jesus. Because we've always got this barrier in the scriptures, is we've got the text, it's whatever the evangelist has done with it, and to try and work out what's behind it is a nice guessing game. We'll find out in heaven. But ultimately, there's only so much that we can go with. It's the text that's in front of us, and that's what we work with. We either take it for what it is, and we try to set a context, or we're forever creating a theory and a hypothesis, and then another hypothesis to back up the hypothesis, and another one, and it's just a never-ending task. So hence form criticism has largely been left in abeyance, because it's just inconclusive in so many ways. While source and form criticism were sometimes helpful in understanding the nature of Jesus' teachings and the way the Gospels are written, scholars ask these questions mainly to test the Gospel's story or the Gospel's story's reliability, not to understand the Gospel's message. Inevitably, scholars began to ask, why does Matthew edit Mark and Q the way he does? This question became the focus of the editorial critics, generally called redaction critics. Contemporary literary criticism. The 1970s began to expose more of the weaknesses of traditional redactional assumptions. Redaction criticism thus gave way to composition criticism, which examines themes that run through the gospel and asks, what does this gospel mean as a whole? So starting to treat it now as a document rather than isolating it, breaking it up into all pericopes and this and that, which not necessarily fitting together, but they have been placed together. More recent literary approaches, such as structuralism and reader response criticism, have approached texts for their transcultural literary themes, or to examine how current readers in various interpretative communities interpret texts. But though literary questions are essential, not all literary approaches are equally helpful for a given purpose. Because ultimately, do you have a community of faith who is interpreting these things, these documents, or you're just seeing it as a document of literature and you're just approaching it without faith, which means you can lead or end up with a whole lot of different conclusions. Sociological, historical, and sociological interpretation. Although the extant evidence is incomplete, it is adequate to allow us to construct a general first-century Mediterranean setting more relevant to the original constructions of Matthew than are our own contemporary settings, which we might otherwise presuppose. Asking social historical questions is therefore essential, provided we acknowledge the requisite limitations imposed by incomplete knowledge of some matters. So Kino realizes, this is not an endless thing, but within reason, robustly, we can go ahead and actually establish the context with a pretty good idea. In all cases, Kino, will give preference to the hard data from archaeological or literary sources over extrapolations from models or generalized cultural patterns, helpful as the latter can sometimes be. Above all, Matthew invites his audience to hear the gospel in the context of the early Christian message. His central discourse is emphatic that only those who press close as persistent disciples of the kingdom can truly understand the message of the kingdom. Matthew's Jewish Christian community, rooted both in the new message of the kingdom and the broader context of Israel's ancient kingdom story, held a special advantage. Matthew as biography. Readers approach different works with different expectations, which affect the meanings they construct on those texts. Expectations also affected the way ancient readers approached works, and many ancients, no less than contemporary literary theorists, recognized this principle. Readers throughout most of history understood the Gospels as biographies, but after 1915, scholars and the Protestant biblical scholars were actually ahead of the Catholic ones because there's no magisterium guiding them, so they were going in all sorts of different directions, and that's why they started to run into these problems as well. Kino, as far as I know, for instance, and same with France, are not Catholic scholars, and yet it just sounds so faithful to our tradition. So 1915, scholars tried to find some other classification for them, mainly because these scholars compared ancient and modern biography and noticed that the Gospels differ from the latter. The current trend, however, is again to recognize Gospels as ancient biographies. The most complete statement of the question to date comes from a Cambridge monograph by Richard A. Burridge. The trend to regard the Gospels as ancient biography is currently strong enough for British Matthew scholar Graham Stanton to characterize the skepticism of Bultmann and others about the biographical character of the Gospels as surprisingly inaccurate. I mean, Bultmann in his day was sort of virtually infallible, the new light, but things are changing. Ancient biographers did not write the way modern biographers do. They could start in the subject's adulthood. They also had the freedom to rearrange their material topically rather than in chronological sequence. Although the historical accuracy of biographers varied from one biographer to another, biographers intended biographies to be essentially historical works. As in other Greco-Roman literature, ancient Jewish literature generally permitted variation in detail. So you see why some evangelists just develop a whole area in a way you think, why did he do that? There's a particular thing, and we'll see that when we look at the texts, particularly the what's that lovely text everybody loves to listen to, the genealogy. The genealogy, we'll look at that and what St. Matthew does with that, as opposed to St. Luke. All four Gospels, written in Greek and probably addressing audiences outside Palestine, are closer to the Greek model. But of course, Jewish documents in Greek typically adopted Hellenistic narrative techniques. That Matthew interprets Jesus in light of the Old Testament is clear, but Matthew also interprets the Old Testament record in light of Jesus. Indeed, had Matthew been creating infancy narratives about Jesus to match Old Testament messianic texts, he usually could have chosen better texts to start with and created stories that matched better. Matthew customizes his account to show fulfillment of prophecy, but this is not the same as creating events from whole cloth. Matthew did not write his gospel without forethought. He was a historian, biographer, and interpreter, and not just a storyteller. Just as speechwriters carefully premeditated their works, writers of narratives began with a rough draft, then revised and polished it. The structure of Matthew. The text of the Gospel of Matthew is not provided with markers to draw attention to a comprehensive outline of sections within which the author intended it to be read. Any proposed outline, including the one I just put on in your hands, outline of the Gospel is thus imposed by the interpreter, not dictated by the author, and is therefore open to discussion as to whether it truly represents the intended shape of the narrative. It is not surprising, therefore, that this Gospel, like most other New Testament books, has been analysed in several different and sometimes contradictory ways. The debate up to the 1980s is well surveyed by D.R. Bauer. So, the extant documents that we have are basically the 2nd or 3rd century. There are no autographs that we call them. So that means actual document written by the evangelist. It's copies of copies of copies. And the scribes are very good in transcribing them. And they love the Word of God. They saw it as something very sacred and did their utmost. But at the end of the day, they're all human beings. And so you get, when you study, one of the fascinating courses I studied at the Biblicum was Textual Criticism. You know how when you get an annotated version of the Bible and at the bottom you've got all that mumbo-jumbo stuff that nobody ever works out? That's called the critical apparatus. And if you're hardcore, it tells you the different, just some, not all of them, of the different codexes. And this one, the Codex Vaticanus, and the Aleppo Code, and the Sinaitic Code. And, the textual critics have gone through it and spent thousands and thousands of hours looking at it, analysing. There were no sentence structures, although Greek has a lot more punctuation than the Hebrew does. But still, you've got to see, okay, well, where's the paragraph end? Okay, there's a question mark, there's a break, but when you look at the various Gospels, why is it that some lines are 1.5 sentences long, others are 2 lines long, or others just half a line, or half a sentence is half a line? What's going on? The textual critics have made a decision and about what's more fitting, and then they've gone with that, and others have gone with it. So, for example, this is the Nestle Ireland edition of the New Testament. It's number 27 edition. There's a 28th edition out now. It's been out for a few years, but I'd already spent my money and bought this one, so I wasn't going to spend more money. But there's only minor differences in them, but for the specialists, they're obviously looking for those differences. And I remember we got a copy of that, those who went to Manly, the Bible Society would come and give us a copy. And I had my copy back in whenever it was, 1989 or 1990 at Manly, and I don't know, I think it was edition number 13 or something like that, so there's been lots of editions since then. Recent discussion has often focused on the search for formulae which may be taken to mark structural divisions. By far the most prominent is the slightly varying formula which concludes Matthew's 5 main collections of Jesus' teaching. And then when Jesus had come to the end of these things, ... and anyway, if you're interested in the references, I can give them to you later on. But in each case, this formula marks the end of a discourse and the beginning of a new phase of the narrative. But the proposal of B.W. Bacon to use this formula as the basis for dividing the whole book into 5 books has not been widely accepted, though it still appears in some more popular accounts of the Gospel. The obvious fact that this formula marks the conclusion of the 5 discourses does not entail that the discourses are themselves the central structural principle of the Gospel. More recent structural schemes have sometimes been based on a different formula. From that time, Jesus began to ... Again, it's an indicator. There's a change of gear in the text. And there's 2 references for that. These words, like the discourse conclusion formula noted above, clearly mark the beginning of a new stage in the story. But a phrase which occurs only twice in the Gospel seems slender basis on which to construct a total framework for the narrative. My own, so we're quoting France now, approach to the structure of Matthew derives from noting how closely Matthew has adhered in broad terms to the overall narrative pattern of Mark, which after a brief prologue set in the wilderness, so chapter 1, verses 1 to 13, presents Jesus' public ministry in 3 phases, set successively in Galilee, on the journey from Galilee to Judea, and in Jerusalem. The impression Mark gives us the impression that Mark gives is that Jesus did not visit Jerusalem at all until the final week of his life. But this conflicts with the far more historically plausible account of John, who has Jesus, like any other religiously observant Galilean, making regular trips between Galilee and Judea, particularly in connection with the major festivals. The simplified structure of a single progress from north, Galilee, to south, Jerusalem, Judea, is thus best understood as one devised by Mark for its dramatic effect in drawing attention to the hostile reception of the Galilean prophet when he ventures into the foreign territory of Judea. Matthew tells the story in the same way. Matthew's prologue is more extensive, providing richer material for scripturally based meditation on the origin and nature of the Messiah. But from chapter 4, verse 17 onwards, Jesus' ministry in Matthew, as in Mark, is set entirely in and around Galilee, until Jesus announces his intention to travel south to Jerusalem in chapter 16, verse 21. Like Mark, Matthew offers a substantial body of material, particularly concerned with the reorientation and training of the disciples on the journey between Galilee and Jerusalem. In fact, Luke has the same thing. So there's a whole course I started doing in the Biblicum called The Journey Towards Jerusalem. So chapter 9:51 in Luke till 19 something. And again, there's all these little hints you keep getting along in the text, but then he set his sight for Jerusalem. He continued towards Jerusalem. There's this movement there. So journey between Galilee and Jerusalem. And Jesus' eventual arrival, Jesus' eventual arrival outside the walls of Jerusalem in 21, verses 1 to 19, is his first narrated approach to the city within this gospel. Even though Matthew, like Mark, will drop a number of hints that Jesus has in fact been there before. So, for example, in chapter 23, verse 37, we've got all the polemic against the woe to you scribes and Pharisees, woe to you blind guys, blah blah blah. Well, Jesus is talking about, I've longed to gather you as chicks under my wings. Well, how's he going to say that if he really hasn't been there before, and he's had this same longing and desire? He gives that away. Or in 27, verse 57, so just towards the end of the Gospel, 28 chapters altogether, Joseph of Arimathea, as an existing disciple. Oh, really? He just became an existing disciple as Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover. He just happened to meet the prophet from Galilee, and I've been waiting to meet him. Oh gosh, you're so great. And it's clearly there's relationships there. And the fact that Jesus can apparently depend on already established local supporters. Go to this whatever, and you run to a gentleman and say, the master has need of your house. I'll be holding the Passover there today. Oh, this guy just happened to say, yep, he heard the prophet from Galilee was there, and therefore he's going to be very open to that. No, the hints are there. Okay, so anyway, there's a couple of references there. The story from that point to Jesus' resurrection is, as in Mark, entirely set in Jerusalem. The one major departure from Mark's geographical outline is that at the end of the Jerusalem phase, there will be a dramatic return to Galilee. In the resurrection accounts, go to Galilee. You will see me in Galilee. Go back north. That's where we hung out together. That's where we did things. That's where I worked miracles. That's where I cast out demons. And you cast out demons in my name. So forth. So that the Messianic mission is triumphantly relaunched in the place where it had originally begun, before the debacle in Jerusalem. Yet even this innovation by Matthew only makes explicit what Mark had twice signaled, that the reunion of the disciples with their risen Lord was to take place back in Galilee. This geographical outline of the story seems to me, this is France now, a more satisfying basis for discerning its narrative structure than the search for verbal division markers. To read the Gospel of Matthew as a continuous narrative structured around the geographical progress of the Messiah from his Galilee homeland to his rejection in Jerusalem, with its final triumphant scene back home in Galilee, is to begin to appreciate its power as a work of literature, not simply as a source for theological or historical data. So you see the limitations in just with the source form redaction criticism. It can only yield so much insight. When you look at it through this technique, you just see much more in it. Given the limitations of using any single pool of ancient data, the safest way to reconstruct a knowledge of the general milieu in which Jesus lived, in which Palestinian Jewish Christians transmitted the traditions, and in which Matthew wrote, is to look for customs and ideas within the widest possible frame of sources. Thus, if 3rd century rabbis, the Qumran sect, and a 2nd century Roman novel all inadvertently attest a common practice, we may guess that some form of this practice widely permeated ancient Mediterranean society. That's effectively what people like Kina and France are trying to do. Standard logic can also be helpful, thank God. But whereas some later Jewish texts contain likely Christian interpolations, other texts bear no signs of direct or indirect Christian influence, suggesting that the Christian practice reflects the influence of the Jewish custom rather than the reverse. Thus, dependence on the widest possible range of sources seems the safest method for reconstructing Matthew's general milieu, even if not always his local situation. Good. Galilee and Jerusalem. Modern readers of the New Testament often know little about the geopolitical world of 1st century Palestine. It is commonly assumed that Jews were an undifferentiated community living amicably in the part of the world we now call the Holy Land, united in their resentment of the political imposition of Roman rule, to which all were equally subject. One of the more significant gains of recent New Testament studies has been the increasing recognition that this is a gross distortion of the historical and cultural reality. In particular, it is now widely recognized that Galilee was in the first century, as indeed it had been ever since the death of Solomon, a distinct province with a history, political status, and culture which set it decisively apart from the southern province of Judea, despite the fact that the latter contained the holy city of Jerusalem, to which all Jews felt a natural allegiance as the focus of the worship of the God of Israel. Are you following this? Is this?
So what was the key point in the northern part?
Well, the northern part is Galilee. So that's where Jesus lived, and is surrounded by Samaritan or basically pagan territory, and that's where he chose to carry out most of his ministry. And then, and we'll find more about that in a minute. But then in the south was Judea, hilly country, and it was the city was there, and the Jewish people had their focus on the temple worship. And I mean, it was only, and the synagogue practice only came after they returned to Judea after the Babylonian deportation. So they 587 BC, and then they spent about 70 years there. And then they came back, and that's when they began to be called Jews, because they're returning to Judea. Before that, they were Hebrews or Semites, you know. So anyway, I'll talk a bit more about that. The situation in the time of Jesus may be drastically oversimplified as follows. So you're going to get 7 criteria now, and just a little insight from France about how different Galilee actually was to Jerusalem. Oh, by the way, before I continue, the southern kingdom, when the split happened, the southern kingdom was the faithful one originally. The son of, what's his name, Solomon, Rehoboam, he chose to listen to his buddies instead of to his father's wise counselors. And anyway, eventually the kingdom was split, and the first kingdom to fall was then the north, and then Judea eventually fell under King Nebuchadnezzar, and it just, anyway. And then there was history for a time carried into deportation. So the first one is racially. The area of the former northern kingdom of Israel had ever since the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century BC, a more mixed population within which more conservative Jewish areas like Nazareth and Capernaum stood in close proximity to largely pagan cities, of which in the 1st century the new Hellenistic centers of Tiberias and Sepphoris were the chief examples. Geographically, Galilee was separated from Judea by the non-Jewish territory of Samaria, and from Perea in the southeast by the Hellenistic settlements of Decapolis, the 10 cities. Politically, Galilee had been under separate administration from Judea during almost all its history since the 10th century BC, apart from a period of reunification, a brief period of reunification under the Maccabees. And in the time of Jesus, it was under a supposedly native Herodian prince, while Judea and Samaria had since AD 6 been under the direct rule of a Roman prefect. Well, these things change the landmark. I mean, the people, the attitudes, and so forth. Economically, Galilee offered better agricultural and fishing resources than the more mountainous territory of Judea, making the wealth of some Galileans the envy of their southern neighbors. Culturally, Judeans despised their northern neighbors as country cousins, their lack of Jewish sophistication being compounded by their greater openness to Hellenistic influence, which is what leads some scholars to say that Jesus not only knew Aramaic and Hebrew, but he may well also have taught and spoken Greek. And I'd never heard that before, but it's a minority opinion. But it wouldn't go against reason. If you're surrounded by Hellenistic cities, what's going to come from there? It's not Aramaic or Hebrew, it's going to be Greek. or a version of it. I mean, there were so many different versions. And Hellenistic Greek had left the classical period. There was a tendency, like so many languages around the world now, to just become simpler and simpler, and in a sense become more corrupted. So that by the time you get to the New Testament, the Greek, the koine, is not exactly, Homeric Greek or something like that. And you've got, you do have the Shakespeare of the New Testament, like St. Paul basically, but then by the time you get to John, it's very simple Greek. And anyway, so we see these influences there.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yeah.
Pagan countries, in what way? Because they have no faith at all, whatever I don't know.
Okay.
But or have not the same faith as the Jews and.
No, good question. The Samaritans were not pagans. Pagans is not no God, it's false gods. So worshipping statues, idols, the sun, the moon, the earth, the rivers, the whatever. The Jews were pagans because they worshipped their river, the Amun-Ra, the god. The Nile River was the river Happy. So I suppose it became unhappy when all the decay and the life died in there. But the Samaritans believed mostly that the revelation from God was the law, the Torah. So that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and some of them believed also in the prophets. Whereas the Jews, in fact, I didn't bring my Old Testament, the Hebrew, but it's written. It's got Torah, Navi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, Ud Ketuvim. So it's just so the law, the prophets, and the writings. They believed all as part of divine revelation. And Samaria, believed in various things there, but then the Decapolis, they're 10 Greek cities. So your guess is as good as mine what they believed in.
Excuse me, Mark. Cultural differences. Was there a cultural difference in the role of women from the south to the north? The reason I'm asking is that you see the Lucan situation, Mary goes on her own to see Elizabeth and things like that. Now, then you read in other areas.
We don't know. It's just silence. It's an argument from silence. It's like we'll get one of the texts is about the Last
women
Supper.
following Jesus on their own.
Absolutely, and Luke is very clear on that. And they supported him out of their own means. There were women he'd healed from various, so the broken women restored again. But the answer, and so one of the questions is at the Last Supper, since they'd gone up to Jerusalem with him, would they be there with him? And the tradition is pretty clear that it was the 12. But it's not beyond the realm of possibility that in an adjoining room there would have been the women and other men who weren't part of the 12, who then would have also done the serving at the table and so forth. But again, it's an argument from silence.
But it's not clear in culture whether let's call it the Southern Kingdom, had a different attitude to women to the Northern Kingdom.
I don't think that would have been. This is my guess. I haven't read about it, or at least I haven't come across it in the reading. But I would guess women would not have had the considerations that they would now. I would say it'd be pretty even fair, but there'll be some differences as like linguistically, economically. If the North is more prosperous, then with prosperity maybe comes more education, a better standard of living, a better knowledge. If they're going to be surrounded by Greek Hellenistic culture, you're going to have a more open mind worldview. If you're in a more secure environment, like in the south with Jerusalem, then you're going to be, it's more Jewish. You'll have different attitudes, and that would affect women as men as well as the men. That's my guess. But as specifically as you're asking, I can't say.
Can I have a second question, please?
You can have a third. Gives me a break.
That same word, pagan, in our town here, that word fit in our town here at all now. Pagan. It didn't, because I don't dare to say to use that same word to say, whoever don't have faith like ours. I mean.
Now it's got negative connotations. That's why you've got to be careful about using it. But in its strict understanding of the original meaning of the word, there are lots of pagans around. who
Well, we
just
did say, so
believe
I
in
believe
false
that,
gods,
yeah,
yeah. But I mean, now we would choose different words, bit of political correctness, but also language changes, and so you don't want to necessarily offend somebody. You might just say, look, you don't have any faith, and people will admit you might say there's I don't have any faith, but also you might say and some people will readily admit that. So I'm an atheist, whereas more often they mean as an agnostic. I find it difficult to believe, but they still, others will say, no, I do believe there's a God, but I just don't believe in the Christian God. So, okay, then they're not pagans in that strict original meaning of the word. Yeah.
What are those people that say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, Father?
But I'm spiritual, yeah. or like the other classic one of, I like Christ, but I hate the church. Whereas, in fact, how do you separate the head from the body? But anyway, you can't get into all the theological things with them.
Probably true to think it's more continual in most circumstances.
I think there's so much, and that's why I often keep coming back to God's the judge. God's my judge, God's everyone else's judge. And if Daniel, the Aramaic, God is my judge, Daniel. It just explains, well, it makes us stop where we should stop in making those judgments or calls about a person's heart and so forth. I mean, we scarcely know our own heart, at least I speak for myself. But it's there's cracks and things that surface that keep on surprising me. So
the Sadducees only believe in the first 5 books of the Torah too, don't they?
I'm not sure if that's the only thing they believed in, but certainly they didn't believe in spirit, resurrection, and so forth. And that's why we get the question to our Lord about the woman who'd be married to 7 brothers and so forth. If you want to read something, and I mean, he's got John Paul Meyer from, I'm sure if he's still alive, from Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. He's written this 4-volume work called A Marginal Jew. And in, I think, volume 3 or volume 4, he's got a whole 100 pages on the Pharisees, 100 pages on the Sadducees, 100 pages on Essenes, Qumran or something. It's just, he's not, I wouldn't recommend reading it for spiritual reading. It's not, like reading Franz or Kina, it'll sort of fill you with a stronger faith. But lots of information, lots of knowledge, and he has a particular approach to the historical critical method that's just focuses on the text, but outside he kind of comes from an optic of skepticism. So unfortunately, it doesn't yield a lot of the other good results that could be. In fact, Benedict, in his first volume on Jesus of Nazareth, has a little footnote about him, and then John Paul Meyer responds to him in his 4th volume. He says, and as an astute observer, noted that the historical critical method has some limitations, so Patrick,
just thinking of north and south, Samaria's in the middle, isn't it?
It's to the, to the west, I think, while Judea and, beg your pardon, it's surrounding it, so it's not in the middle. No, the middle is the only section that's still Jewish all the way. So it's you've got Samaria, and then the Perea, and then in the southeast by the Hellenistic settlements of the 10 Greek.
Did the Roman occupation treat Judah, Galilee, and Samaria in a different way, or was it just they just took the territory?
They had different governors, and but I couldn't tell you any more than that. That guy could. But I mean, as Galilee, was under a different prefect, a Herodian prince. Whereas Judea and Samaria in 6 AD were under a Roman prefect. So they're different governance for sure. Yeah, and that has its own implication.
Mark, didn't the Samaritans, or still do, I think there's still some of them around out there, didn't they consider themselves the pure Jews? Because they stuck to the 5 books of the law, whereas Jews
Yeah.
have gone outside of that.
Well,
That-
the only Jews after the fall of the temple in 70 AD that remain are Pharisees now. They're the only, so the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they were all, and scribes belonged to both of them. They were basically political movements, but they obviously believed certain things. The Samaritans' focus for worship was Mount Gerizim. And whereas obviously for the Jews it was in Jerusalem, and that discussion there with our Lord in the
Woman, yeah.
in the woman, John's Gospel chapter 4, I think. But it's I didn't know there were any Samaritans actually still around, but there could be various
I think
people,
so.
you know.
There's a very small community
Yeah.
because of the fact that they would marry they would only marry within the community.
Within,
There was a lot
okay.
of breeding,
Yeah.
and that's because there's only a very, very small community left.
700 or something.
Yeah.
Oh wow, okay.
And they're very centralized.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And in living in Samaria.
Mount
biblical Samaria.
Gerizim, yes.
Mount Gerizim. There
There
you
was an
go.
article in the
Oh,
press.
someone, Michael Hilly just come in. Someone wants to grab him.
There was an article in the press a couple of years ago
Okay.
by a Samaritan priest, etc. They interviewed him around
Okay.
Christmas time.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
I'd love to hear that, read
How
that
they,
interview.
How they survived.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry to ask this question.
No,
It's pretty useless. The Jewish people who have been left in Iraq,
Yes.
they would have been in Iraq before the fall of the temple.
I don't know. I guess so.
So there would have been sections. I would have thought. There would have been sections. I would have thought
Yeah.
there were in the diaspora who survived in the diaspora after the fall of the
Sure.
temple.
I mean, they dispersed all over the place for sure. And
Just I'm just aware of
Mm.
it because they left
Well,
after the fall of Saddam.
and that's what France is trying to get at, and saying that this view that the Jews were all united and lived together harmoniously in one big happy family is just a false conception of Judaism in first century Palestine. So there were Jews all over the place. I mean, there were Jews in Rome. Paul's writing their letter to them without having been there. So, you know, they moved around. Travel was real. Not everybody stayed put. So. Okay, great. Economically, sorry, I've covered that one. Culturally, Judeans despised their northern neighbours as country cousins, their lack of Jewish sophistication being compounded by their openness to Hellenistic influence. Linguistically, Galileans spoke a different form of Aramaic, whose slovenly consonants, they dropped their H's, so anyway, I'd have to look at some examples to see there, but it would make a big difference, you know. The Hebrew has two H's, he and het. So if you're dropping those, it's going to, you know, Adonai Elohim, Adonai Ehad. It's going to change some of the Lord God, the Lord is one. It's going to change your pronunciation. Yeah. And so they were the butt of Judean humour. Religiously, the Judean opinion was that Galileans were lax in their observance of proper ritual, and the problem was exacerbated by the distance of Galilee from the temple and the theological leadership, which was focused in Jerusalem. How are we for time?
It's 11 o'clock. We probably need a break at
Yeah.
some stage.
So I'm about halfway. Well, let's go for another 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes and then
Yeah,
a break.
and then we'll have a break. Yeah. If, as this is France, I hope this is not a complete caricature. So, having said all this, it means that even an impeccably Jewish Galilean in first century Jerusalem was not among his own people. He was as much a foreigner as an Irishman in London or a Texan in New York. His accent would immediately mark him out as not one of us, and all the communal prejudice of the supposedly superior culture of the capital city would stand against him to be heard even as a prophet, let alone as the Messiah, a title which everyone knew belonged to Judea. To recognize the realities of the situation is to gain new insight into the obstacles facing Jesus of Nazareth in gaining acceptance as a credible Messiah in the southern province, despite, or even perhaps because of, the enthusiasm he had excited in his own province. We shall note this element in the narrative, especially of Jesus' first arrival outside the walls of Jerusalem in chapter 21, verses 1 to 11, and it will be a constantly underlying element in the subsequent confrontation between the Galilean prophet and the Jerusalem establishment. When Jesus arrives at Jerusalem, it is only Matthew who comments on the reaction not only of the accompanying crowds, but also of the people of the city. And the two rival teams of Galileans and Judeans are seen as starkly opposed in their attitudes to the northern prophet. When Peter, as distinctive a northerner as his master, is unmasked in the high priest's courtyard, it is, Matthew tells us, as a companion of Jesus the Galilean. So the accent, why your accent gives you away. You know, it's pretty hard to hide. To read Matthew in blissful ignorance of first century Palestinian sociopolitics is to miss his point. This is the story of Jesus of Nazareth. Fulfilment, the formula quotations. I've argued elsewhere that the central theme of Matthew's Gospel is fulfillment. The opening genealogy is designed to portray the coming of the Messiah as the climax of the history of God's people. And the remainder of chapters 1 to 2 directs the reader's attention to a wide variety of aspects of God's revelation in the Old Testament, which find their fulfillment in the coming of Jesus. The opening of the book thus sets the tone for Matthew's whole Gospel. The UBS Greek New Testament lists 54 direct citations of the Old Testament in Matthew, and a further 262 allusions and verbal parallels. And that is a conservative figure based only on the most widely recognized allusions. This typological understanding of Old Testament scripture, which is widely deployed in the New Testament, notably in the letter to the Hebrews, finds one of its most enthusiastic exponents in the author of the first Gospel. See, one of the reasons why Matthew has the genealogy as well, I'll talk about this when we get to it, is that he wants to establish the connection that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and because that's where the prophecies are. So it's a fulfillment of the Old Testament, but also it gives the credibility. So he's talking about his pedigree, and which is what one of the tasks that the genealogies are meant to do. Then he's establishing that. It is thus for Matthew not only the explicitly predictive portions of the Old Testament that can be seen to be fulfilled in Jesus, but also its historical characters, its narratives, and its cultic patterns, even the law itself. It is a matter of tracing lines of correspondence and continuity in God's dealings with his people, discerned in the incidental details of the biblical text as well as in its grand design. Those who have studied the interpretation of Scripture among other Jews at the time, particularly at Qumran and among the rabbis, recognize that they are on familiar ground in Matthew, sometimes in the actual interpretive methods he employs, but also more widely in the creative ways he goes about to discovering patterns of fulfillment, ways which modern exegetical scholarship often finds surprising and unpersuasive. Patterns of fulfillment not necessarily in what the original Old Testament texts had in mind, but in what can be perceived in their writings with Christian hindsight. So it seems that far from being a pre-existing set of proof texts, sometimes we get this sense of, so that it could be fulfilled, the scripture could be fulfilled, as if there's this magic number of quotes and off we go. It isn't like that. It's more fluid, but it's faithful at the same time. And that does go against sort of our times where we kind of want to have German engineering precision on matters that are actually not designed like that. and so there's an adjustment that's required on our part. So it seems that far from being a sort of proof text, the Old Testament passages cited in the formula quotations have been brought freshly to Matthew's mind by the traditions he has received, and that he has then worded those traditional stories in such a way as to help the reader to see the connection, keeping in mind that very few people in those days could actually read. So the gospel was actually meant to be read out. Whereas, say, the Gospel of Mark, being only 16 chapters long, could be read out in one sitting. And it's an engaging story, it's this, it's that, and whatever, and people could sit there and listen. But 28 chapters in Matthew, And when you look at it, it's clear that it's more catechetical in nature. So it would have been used in the local communities as teaching, instruction, and you'll see where the different tensions. Sometimes they're not so much tension, but they're but how they make sense when seen from this point of view. The formula quotations are thus not in themselves part of Matthew's tradition, but his own editorial gloss on the story of Jesus. Their and elusive quality is testimony to the ingenuity of his pervasive midrashic agenda, of which these 11 quotations are but the most prominent and distinctive outcrops. When we hear the word midrash, the kind of colloquial meaning we attach to it is that, it's just kind of made up humbo jumbo. But it's in fact, midrash comes from two Hebrew words, darash, from the inquiry. So it's actually the result of an inquiry, and that's what midrash is. So it's actually like you might say, a serious theological opinion in our own terminology. Bernard, you just let me know when.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay, so yep, I can do that. And then who, where, when, how? 4 questions. Author of the Gospel of Matthew. Attribution of this Gospel to Matthew the Apostle goes back to our earliest surviving patristic testaments, and there is no evidence that any other author was ever proposed. It often seems to be assumed that whatever the early church said about origins of the New Testament books must be treated with suspicion, unless it can be independently proved. But France, do not share that assumption. And basically sides with St. Irenaeus, 140 AD, I think to 210 to 20, and he says, he got it right. Provenance. I am happy to accept the general consensus that it was somewhere in Syria or Palestine, the latter being general assumed in patristic accounts, but I'm less convinced by the confident assertion of some that the specific location was Antioch. My own understanding of the situation of Matthew and his community locates the gospel in a...
Sorry, I have to break.
Oh, great. Well, I'll just finish this page and I'll be right. I'll be done. Yeah.
Personally, my mind is full.
Okay, well, I'll finish this paragraph then. The gospel in a period of uncomfortable tension, which may have been experienced at any point during the middle and latter parts of the 1st century, depending on the way relation with the synagogue had developed in their particular community. So, good. We'll stop there, and then we'll continue after the break.